Welcome once again to the Old Statue podcast, episode 7 today, and we've got another guest with us today, Anthony, so thanks for joining us, Anthony.
Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by East Coast Recovery, an online addiction treatment centre based in the east of England. This episode is sponsored by Rehabs UK, the definitive place to go to find rehabilitation treatment and advice. So once again today we're joined by Anthony, been in recovery now for around 11 years, came through ECR, known Leicester this whole time, and understand you guys have kept in touch as well. Now I know you've done a lot of things since the sort of 11 years and your time in recovery. You've worked in homeless centres, you've worked with the YMCA, you've worked with county lines, so you've given a lot of yourself to other people. So I'm sure there's amazing stories there that we really want to get into. But before we get to that point, before you arrived at ECR even, can you tell us a little bit about how it all began for you?
Yeah, so again, as I say, when I go to a meeting, which is not so often nowadays, but it was just a few days ago I said it in an online meeting. Don't really want to labour that too much, but as is with a lot of people, and I said on the car journey on the way here, that it was innocent and naive when I was 13, and some lads had some weed, and it was innocent and naive to say, right, I want to go on this, and this is how I all started smoking a bit of cannabis, and it's quite often the case that a lot of people start off from that point. But just quickly, and then I'll go on to that, is that there's a degree of stupidity in my mind as well to do that, because whether I was 13 or not, or whether I was in a family where addiction was quite the case, or whether it wasn't, we all know it isn't such a good idea deep down, but we do it anyway. So yeah, I started smoking cannabis.
Do you think that's kind of like, because it's not a good idea, it's the rebellious bit of the rebellious nature, you kind of want to rebel, so it's like smoking, you might not like it,
yeah. Well, it is that. It's interesting, isn't it? Even with my children, if I say, don't go and touch that over there, there's a part of them that's like, right, I want to go touch this over there. And I think it's the same. If society and mum and dad and the school are saying, don't smoke that weed, it'll make you a bit mad, I want to know what a bit mad is.
Well, who were the cool kids?
Who were the ones that were doing these behind the school sheds? I didn't want to be with Joe and Mary and Tom and Harry all sat there figuring out, their maths and stuff. I wanted to be with the cool kids. So it was innocent and naive and relatively consequence-free at the beginning of smoking cannabis. And over the space, and again, as I said, in my experience, that things are progressive. And it certainly was the case with me, and not just months, but years. And then another decade beyond those years that got me to the point of, we'll probably get to that later on in the podcast, that I then started to take amphetamines when I was 15, 16. And then ecstasy came on the scene, and, this was back in the late 90s, and that was a huge thing. And I've got to say, I had a lot of fun. And I've got to say, I've got to say, I didn't thieve at that point. I held down a job. My mum and dad were relatively unaware, although if I have a conversation with them now, they might say, no, we know, but it certainly wasn't causing arguments within the family home. And
if somebody said, why are you doing drugs? Because this is always interesting to me, this bit that you're talking about, is because a lot of the time, and I think people often do it to elicit emotion or self-pity or pity from other people, that they go, I took drugs because of a bad childhood or all that kind of thing. And in the rehab, I often used to ask that question, why did you start taking drugs? And people go, I was molested, my dad left me, mum, I'm gay, blah, blah, blah. Not to undermine any of that stuff, because it obviously happens to people, but it's like, no, why did you start drinking and taking drugs? And like you said there, you didn't think, I feel like I've got low self-worth, I'm going to go and smoke some pot, or I've got low self-worth, so I'm going to go to a rave and take ecstasy.
That was not a conscious thought at all.
And for most people, when you break it down, it's actually not. They only sort of come to that when it becomes troublesome for them.
Yes.
Then somebody asks, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
Then they think, it's because...
Yeah.
of this. I don't think many people go, oh, I've got low self-esteem, I need some heroin. They just sort of, it ends up there because, but mostly it's a social thing that they start doing, and it just gets out of hand.
And then I even think then, and it's only because I've worked with so many people, that is it's a default excuse. Mum and Dad were doing this, I was molested, I've got low self-esteem, I was bullied at school, or whatever it may be. I think that you learn as the months and the years go on and being around other people that are using substances, because you're not going to be knocking around with people that don't use substances if you do substances. You're only going to be knocking around with people that do substances. And you learn that if you want to capture the emotion of the person asking why you're doing the substances, fall onto a story like that.
Yeah. Yeah, because you get the people they say, look, if that's the case, and again, there's a big thing that all people are addicts because of trauma. And again, I'm not discounting that completely. I just don't completely subscribe to that. Because I don't believe it's the truth. I think it's people's reaction to trauma. And it's hard to find people that haven't got some sort of trauma that they could point it at. And again, I do think that is a bit of a catalyst to a degree that makes people more susceptible to becoming a full-blown sort of drug addict or alcoholic. But I definitely think that you get the guys that then go, I can't put my finger on any of that in my childhood. I'm still having the same experience as them.
Yeah.
I wonder, Anthony, if you could tell me that story again that you told me on the way here in the car about the two twins.
Yeah, well, I think
that really puts it into perspective for a lot of people.
I think it was either Leicester or one of Leicester's employees in the treatment centre that we heard this years ago of the social worker that was working with some twin girls, hypothetically speaking, and the twin girls, their mum and dads were drug addicts and alcoholics, and the social worker was in their lives for several years until they became adults, and then that professional relationship ended just because they became adults, and it's just the way it is. And the social worker retired and she moved away, and anyway she visited the town where she left as a retiree, and she thought, I really want to catch up with Sarah and Kelly, for instance, to see how they're doing. I really enjoyed working with them, I hope they're okay. And then one day she tracks down Sarah and she goes to this really run-down, deprived council estate with rubbish in the garden and drawn curtains and looking quite dark and not a very attractive looking house. And she knocks on the door and hey presto, Sarah answers the door looking quite ill and gaunt and not well nutritioned, with her head down, and she makes contact with makes conversation. How are you? I ain't seen you for a few years. How is everything? Well, I'm on heroin and methadone, and my kids have been taken, and life's not good, and I might be going to prison next month. Well, what do you expect with a mum and dad like mine? And then the next day, the social worker, she goes back to the hotel and a little bit, sad because of what she's seen. And the next day, she tracks down the other twin, Sarah, for instance, and she shows up to a really nice middle-class estate. She shows up to this house that looks really nice and clean and curtains open and looks bright and welcoming and warm and homely inside, and got a nice car in the garden and flowers and the lawn's cut, everything's done. And she knocks on the door and the other twin opens it, and looking in her office clothes, kids happily playing in the background, and oh, how are you? I haven't seen you for a few years. I just wanted to catch up with you. Well, I'm fantastic. I've got a good job. My husband's doing well in his business. The children are doing well at school. The house is coming along nice. She says, well, what do you expect with a mum and dad like mine? And it's the response and the perception. I don't think that trauma is
I think it is the response. I think in the AA book, that was an important bit to me. That took me a few years to actually understand, but it said, look, the world and the people are quite often wrong. There's no denying that a lot of people have had bad parenting or been abused, but it's not all of them turn into drug addicts and alcoholics, so it can't just be trauma alone. It has to be how the person responds to it. And I personally think that that's the part that we need to look at to say, that part of me, I need to keep a close eye on, because it's about my responses to what's going on in life. Because I find things quite traumatic. And again, having a wife that's a non-alcoholic, non-addict, I find things that are quite traumatic that don't even register on her scale. And she's like, "What is wrong with you?" And I'm like, "I don't really know." It shocks me how traumatising I can find such simple things, usually to do with government and authority. I find authority quite traumatic. Not, but it's my response to it.
Yeah,
So,
I relate to that actually.
Yeah, I think a lot of
The
people
last
do.
3 years, and it is. And if we're gonna use that as a precedent, trauma, and all of its varying, all of the varying circumstances and life situations and life events that might happen that might cause trauma within us, then you're going to find it very difficult to find any adult on this planet that hasn't got trauma, because life happens to us. We all lose loved ones, we all fail, and we all succeed. It's very.
Well, it doesn't have to be anything even major.
No, it can be. I was bullied for 2 days at school.
It
It
can
can
be
be
your dad
anything.
looking at you with an angry face
Yeah.
when you're in a vulnerable moment of your emotional growth. It doesn't even have to be
A major
because
thing.
it's a response thing.
Yes.
But again, I don't disagree with trauma, but I think the response bit it's a responsibility. It's my responsibility to see how I'm responding. I think that's where the best work
Yeah.
gets done. So I didn't want to take you off your path too much there. I just thought that's such an important point for me to try and highlight to people that it's about. And again, I think that's why I love the 12-step program, because it's all about infantry. It's all about looking at your responses. It's acknowledging the world and the people are wrong, but it's looking at the way you're responding to that and try and get more healthy, more constructive responses and building them into your life, which is it's not a natural thing for me. It's something I have to manually do, which is called work in the program. I manually have to, and I don't always know. I come from a family that's not great at dealing with problems. I have to find other people to sometimes say, I don't know what to do here. Can you teach me how to respond better to this problem? The response I got is usually quite aggressive, I find. If I'm unsure, I can become aggressive very quickly. Not that I don't go punching people. I feel like it, but I don't.
Emotionally aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand.
Push
Yeah.
people away, so that's not such a good thing. So sorry about that. It's probably a bit off the track. So sort of back to you, mate. To your what you sort of growing up was like. You've gone into the rave scene.
Yeah, I've gone into the rave scene. It's probably important to add as well now, and then I'll come back to. My mum and dad did the best with what they could, and I can't really fault them. With what they had, they did the best that they could, I think. Probably my mum and dad, their parents were worse parents than what mine were. But I always had a nice, welcoming home, a clean bed. There was always food. My school clothes were always cleaned. And there was certainly no abuse in the house, not physical or sexual. We might say neglect, but that's why I wanted to emphasise they did the best with what they knew at the time. So yeah, I went into the rave scene. I think I was 17 or 18, I can't remember exactly. And this is where the having fun, the innocence, the relatively consequence-free recreational use of drugs, even amphetamines and cannabis use, even though I was using every day, really, it was a good 4 or 5 years of things didn't get that bad. And then when I was 18, I remember we came back from a nightclub, and this fella came to my mate's shed, and he had some heroin. And going back, I was 17. This is 23, 24 years ago, and going back then, heroin was not. It was it wasn't as on the scene as what it is now. So
I think it become part of the rave scene for some people, though, didn't it? As a come down, a way of. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds completely.
Theory didn't add up.
And there was a lack of understanding about what it was. I don't know whether Trainspotting was out at the time, and the reason that I say a movie about it was Trainspotting brought a great awareness to the nature of the devastating effects of heroin addiction. I think it really did a lot for people's like, whoa, I didn't realise that heroin was like that, and I think it did a great job at creating awareness. But anyway, I was like same as I was when I was that 13-year-old boy, and I wanted to smoke a bit of weed. That stupidity came in, and that curiosity, like, wow, what's this? Here's the next thing. And there started nearly 11-year path of heroin addiction, because it took me probably less than 2 months to be smoking heroin every single day. And then very quickly, whilst that took 5 years of smoking cannabis, taking amphetamines and doing all of those things, within the space of a short few weeks, I tried it once, I vomited, I itched my skin till I had friction burns everywhere. I woke up the next day and I didn't do it for another week. I thought nothing of it, and then I did it the weekend after. But within the space of a few short weeks, no more than 2 months, I was smoking heroin every day. Within the space of 6 months, I started stealing things out of the house. I lost my job. I lost weight. And then the true chaos started. True, absolute chaos. I lost all control in every respect imaginable. And then it was 10 years of... I went to prison. I was homeless. I stole, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of pounds off my father. I had my mum and dad both in tears on so many occasions. I overdosed when I was 20 years old, and I remember waking up and I had cannulas all inside of me. I was on this bed. I can't really remember anything. All I know is that my dad was on the end of the bed with his head in his arms like that, crying. That was the first time I'd seen my dad crying. I'd been resuscitated. I'd died. And the paramedics brought me back to life. And you know what? I remember saying that. I remember saying, I promise, Dad, I'll never do this again. I'm very sorry. And the next day I was out using heroin again. I was completely against. I meant it in that time. I absolutely meant. I wasn't going to do it. I looked at my dad and I was like, whoa, what is going on? I've just been brought back to life.
Just for the people that might not have had an addiction or just listening to learn about it, what was it that made you, do you think, go back from your point of view?
To
like
go
the next
to
day
go back.
after dying, being resuscitated, promising your dad, meaning it, and then the very next day you're doing it again. That's hard for people to understand that are not addicts. Just wonder what your take on that is.
Well, to answer that, let me rewind to an hour ago in the car when I says that the physical detox or the craving physically can be sorted out quickly, but what's left is a mind that doesn't stop. And it was I had no mental defence. That to pick my cup up, first my mind has to say to do it. And to stop using heroin, first my mind has to tell me to stop going around the dealer's house and buying it, and stop going to get some paraphernalia from Boots to inject myself. My mind has to tell me to stop doing these things before my body stops doing it. And my point is, answer is that there was no mental defence. My mind was going to get that heroin. Even if I was telling me not to do it, it was going to happen. There was
there
no
that vague sense? Is there a vague sense of this ain't right, or is that
100%? 100%. But it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough. And that was it. That was 10 years. I started smoking crack, but ultimately heroin was the main thing that dominated every aspect of my life. Every waking moment, heroin. Taking heroin or getting the means to take heroin dominated every aspect of my life until I was very, very fortunate that my substance misuse worker. And then I again, important to say that I did get put on methadone within a year of taking it, and I spent 10 years on methadone as well. Important to say these are my real teeth as well. I'm quite lucky. 10 years on methadone. A lot of people it rots them.
Did you find that helped you at all?
Well, yes and no. It helped me to not be in agony in the morning. But in terms of did I stop using heroin? No, never once. And I never met another person that did.
No. So
temporarily they might have done. And when I say temporarily, I mean a week or two. And they're feeling good about themselves and telling everybody, I haven't used for 2 weeks now, I'm just on my methadone, everything's great. It was as fleeting as they're telling you was their gap between not using heroin and starting again. I just never encountered
Did you have
anybody.
plans of stopping though? Was that in your mind that this was a path to stopping, or?
I think if I'm honest, I've never been asked that question. But now looking back, stopping was something incomprehensible to me.
Mm.
I couldn't imagine life now with not taking an opiate of some
So
kind.
it's almost like that's who you become,
That's who I've
the
become.
drug addict, and that's what drug addicts did, was take methadone and
Yeah.
do whatever else you were doing, and that was it.
It wasn't a conscious thought. It wasn't a conscious thought, but it was like, this is how it is.
Mm.
And the idea of not taking methadone or heroin was just incomprehensible. The only other people that I had witnessed that had stopped taking it was 6 feet under the ground or were in prison. And even when they was in prison, to my knowledge, they were still able to get it. But that's it. It was not a known thing. And as the years went on, I was quite lucky that I got funding from Ad Action. I was in Lincolnshire at the time where I live, and it was Ad Action. I think in Norfolk we have, is it Turning Point? I'm a bit out of all those circles
Change,
now.
Grow, Live.
Yeah, Change, Go, Live. It varies from region to region, doesn't it? And I got funding to then go into Leicester's treatment centre, East Coast Recovery, where I was kind of. It was quite a bit of a process, up to a year, as I recall, in treatment, where my journey to recovery.
You could get long-term sort of treatment.
Yes, yeah.
Well, it sounds like that's, after hearing Kelly's story last week, and if you've not listened to that, guys, on the podcast, please do go check that one out because it's an amazing story. But she was back and forth, and she was 6-7 rehabs. Took her a very long time just to kind of get settled and get kind of started on that path. How was it for you? When did you decide that you needed that help? When did you contact this place, or was there an intervention? Like how did you get into the centre?
Well, my substance misuse worker, I was with her for a number of years, and I think here's what it was. I was on such an amount of methadone, they wouldn't put it up anymore. I think I got to a point, I think it was 130 mils a day. They wouldn't put it up anymore. And as with a lot of these organisations in the public sector, every 2 years or whatever it was back then, they would kind of change things a bit. They'd have a reshuffle and say, we need to do this or we need to do that. And they said, you can't carry on using and giving us a positive test every time that you come here once a week and still be taking the methadone. We need to see some effort. And we had a conversation about going to treatment, and I jumped on it. I was open to it. I know I've met some people over the years and in treatment, they said, no way, I'm not going to rehab. But there was something in me I wanted it. I was very, very ill.
Because that was
mentally.
very much about abstinence as well. It wasn't like we're going to.
I didn't know that at the time, Lester.
Oh, you didn't?
No. When I was in Lincolnshire, abstinence was something, if you had asked me what it meant, I said, I don't know what that means. You'd have to give me a dictionary. I wouldn't even know what it meant.
Yeah.
I think things were that bad, not just externally, but within myself, emotionally and psychologically. Things were that bad. It was just like, I don't know, just take me out of this situation because I can't do this anymore. It was, the big book calls it pitiful, incomprehensible demoralisation. And it was that bad.
Sums it up.
Yeah. So I was just open to anything. And then fortunately they said, and to be honest, I mean, my dad dropped me off there and I had a bag of clothes, and I was quite happy to give my mum and dad a break. Because deep down within that chronic addiction, there's still an idea of like, oh my God, look at my mum and dad, look what I'm doing, look at my sisters, you know. There was still that deep down. There is a bit of a human left in there amidst all of that chaos. And then over the space of a week, I was introduced to the steps in your treatment centre, which is very much an abstinence-based treatment approach.
Yeah, and I think we take you off the methadone
Instantly
and
onto
bring you onto
Subutex.
Subutex. The reason for that is, as you might have, we've realised with the methadone, it kind of dumbs you down. But with the Subutex, your brain starts to work a bit better again. It becomes clearer.
Yeah,
so we find
definitely. Yeah, I remember that.
It seems a lot more cleaner.
Yeah.
Because we want your brain to start picking up again, and some of them medications prevent that from happening. So it can actually hold you in a place where you're not even able to recover on certain substances.
Do you know what? This sounds a bit extreme, right? But I actually think it's not extreme. It's a good representation or a good mirror reflection about how chronically addictive methadone is. On Lord of the Rings, where you see Gollum, my precious, it reminds me of that.
Mm.
And that's what it is, that clinging to that methadone, waking up in the morning. It's that kind of relationship, if we're going to use Hollywood imagery to kind of capture the nature of what's going on inside of a heroin and a methadone addict.
I think it's
good.
I think it's because of the fear of the detox. See, when I started out, it was proper difficult to get someone off of heroin.
Mm.
But I think as time went on and the processes, realising that if you put someone in rehab, you give them a lot of mental support, a lot of emotional support, plus you put them on better medications that are easier for them to come off. And so we found the people that didn't struggle, the people that really wanted to change, a lot of them would say that's the best detox I ever had. Some people struggled a little bit, but it wasn't anything like it was with people like, really getting sick, really uncomfortable, and so I think that's improved greatly over the years.
Even now, and in fact, funnily enough, I say to my wife in the very odd time that we talk about this, because my wife, she's not in recovery. She's not. I think we spoke about it on the way here. She's what we would say is normal. That I kind of, in some way, it's such a far distant memory, but I do remember that the detox was horrific. I still say that now. However, of course, it was necessary, but being in the environment
that holds you
all the time, I could not have done it. Let's just use that.
So I think even in hospital, if people go in hospital, it's not a recovery environment. It's in that recovery environment. I think that's the real big difference,
yes,
a real game changer.
It can hold.
Yeah, because they know you get all the other people helping you, supporting you, encouraging you, and caring about you.
Yeah.
Not they don't do that in hospital. I just think this extra recovery element is the real game changer.
Because, as I remember, probably 80% of the staff were in recovery, and there was certainly a handful of them, of what I can remember. There was Sonia. There was a couple of others. Won't mention their names. There was a couple of others that were of the addiction that I was of, and that was heroin addiction. And having spoken to them, I knew they had been where I had been, but yet they were coming to work looking all smart and helping with the washing up and doing Sunday roast, attending to work. And they was just like, it ain't gonna last long, And I found it a bit annoying and patronising at the time, but I can kind of see that it was perfect what they did, because you don't want pampering to 24 hours a day. I don't think it does anybody good, any good. But the environment and the people held me. There was always a goal I could visually see that I was going to be at next week, next month. And then, wow, 6 months down the line, I could be like
into groups, into groups, getting to the centre, getting yourself out of bed, getting washed. There's no like lying in bed just experiencing the clock.
But you were just telling us, Anthony, about your time at ECR and your time detoxing and how difficult that was. But you had the right people around you, setting a good example, people who had trodden that path before you. So I want to move on a little bit now into what you did after ECR. Maybe we can, you can hark back to your times there if necessary. But you've done a lot for other people since then. You've done your county line stuff. You've worked with young people. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of that story. You mentioned as soon as you kind of found your recovery, you went straight into work. And you've had a really strong work ethic ever since. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't easy. I do remember doing some voluntary work when I was in I think it was third stage treatment that was then introduced for the development of people that needed development. And I remember doing some work then, but in terms of going out into the big wide world and doing this myself, what I knew was I was 28 years old then, 29. What I knew was I didn't want to go back working in the most horrific job. The only job I ever knew was working in the poultry industry. And the only reason that happened is because I could ring somebody up and start work in the morning and get instant cash within about 20 hours. It's the only other reason I did it. And I could get sacked and call him up the day after and start the day after. That's the only other reason I had that kind of work ever. I knew I didn't want to go back to anything like that. I didn't want to go off and do a physical job. I wanted to use my brain a bit. And I think having the experience of spending nearly a year around people in ECR and learning about CBT and learning about, a bit about the human condition or whatever it may be, all of the things that we talked about that, and therapy and self-development and all of those things, it really captured my attention. But I didn't have a reference for a property as a tenant because I'd never been in one. I didn't have a reference for work because I'd never been in work. I didn't have a library card. I didn't have a passport. I had nothing. So as we said in the journey here, there was a housing trust, a charity in Lowestoft, St John's Housing Trust, I think it was called, if I remember rightly. So anyway, I walked in there and had a chat with some of the guys in the office there, briefed over my situation, and they said we can't give you a paid job because you've got no experience, but we like your attitude. I think they said words to that effect. We'll look at doing voluntary work. So I went through the process and did the application, did the DBS, and they was happy to say we can see you're a changed man now, etc., etc. And I think I did 7 months voluntary work before they said, right, we'll offer you a job now. And I spent about a year there, and that was working in a homeless drop-in centre. And then from there, go on, mate.
Sorry, I was going to say, were those first 7 months particularly difficult? Were you really focused in, or was it a shock?
If I'm honest, they weren't difficult. And here's the reason why. I'd just come from this 11-year catastrophic life of heroin addiction, and then spent, I think, 6 weeks I was struggling with the clucking off methadone and thingy, and not sleeping and stomach cramps, and then that soon passed and that was gone. And then I spent 7 or 8 months, and I was actually buzzing from life. I was like, oh my God, I feel human again. I'm eating really well. I'm showering every day.
Well, and we had you'd have to work as well and do voluntary stuff. So we did a lot of back to work things for people, just so people know it's not just sort of clucking off drugs. It was
there was a whole. That was just the initiating.
There's a lot of education and work opportunities, and so you'd been pretty much doing stuff up until leaving. There's no sitting around.
Okay, yeah.
So you're sort of a bit more work ready anyway, weren't you?
Yeah. There was no sitting around at all. And
only in groups.
Only in groups, yeah. And even that was still development.
All development.
But there was no sitting around at all. And I wanted it like that as well. It wasn't like, oh, this is too much. I wanted it like that. Because, I felt human again. I felt really good. I felt healthy, energetic. My mind was clear. I was loving doing the recovery stuff.
Yeah, part of a fellowship of friends and people.
Yeah, it talks about in the book, doesn't it, that we found a new camaraderie. There was a joy amongst us, and that was certainly the case. So it wasn't difficult. If anything, I was just very zestful for life. So I didn't really find it that difficult.
We call it being empowered. That's the purpose of our kind of recovery. Empowers the person's brain to fire up, so their natural desires kick in, their aspirations rise, and then they do what Anthony did. They go and start getting on with life and finding their own jobs, because they can now, because they're not hindered by a drug.
Got this new ability, this new
Yeah,
power.
it's about empowering people.
You want to go make the most of it and test out your new superpower for life.
They're getting high on life.
I did find, because the nature of the work that I was working with vulnerable people, in a homeless drop-in centre, and there was a lot of paperwork, as there is whenever you're working with vulnerable people. There's lots of paperwork involved, and the academic side of it, it's something I learned because I was uneducated. I left school when I was 14 and went to work on a farm. I didn't have a single GCSE, so that side. But again, I just enjoyed learning. I just seemed to enjoy everything. I remember walking down the beach most days and going back to whatever stage environment I was in. It was a third stage environment. I think I had my own flat on Bethel Street, was it?
Oh yeah, above
Bethel
the
Street,
coffee
yeah.
shop.
I was in one of those for some time. And I just had a zest for life. So I didn't find it that difficult. If anything, I found it more exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I could see a future, and the future was bright, in the words of Orange. So I didn't really find it that difficult, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then after that, I soon thought, you know what, I want to do something else, because it was quite a... I don't know. The environment. I soon became. I was changing at a rapid pace. In some senses, in the environment, there was a lot of elderly people using this homeless drop-in centre. I wanted something new, and I saw this job for supporting a young man that had a brain injury, and it was also in Lowestoft, and the money was quite good, and it was a different nature of work. Anyway, I went up for the interview, and I got the job, despite my DBS. And do you know what I found is that the world can be quite forgiving if you've got the right attitude, and somebody could see that what they're seeing on paper is not what they're seeing now. They're willing to give you a chance, and that was quite refreshing to me, actually, because I thought, you know, with 17 criminal offences or something, I thought, well, I ain't really got a lot of hope. But that wasn't true. It wasn't true.
That's inspiring.
In fact, not once has it stopped me. And I went on to become... I worked in higher education for 7 years and did a couple of years teaching, and I worked in a mental health institute and worked for homeless hostels in Norwich, where I live now, and never once has my criminal history been an issue. So I think I found that quite refreshing, that the world is quite forgiving, certainly in this country anyway.
Yeah, that goes against a lot of the preconceptions, doesn't it? You kind of think, well, you know, if I've got this criminal record or you know, I've got these marks against my name, then it's hopeless. I might as well give up now. But you're living proof that that's not the case. And as long as your attitude's right, you know, you alter your attitude, you can
Alter
make
that
changes.
Well, I think it all comes down to risk assessment, so it depends on sort of level of risk. I think
Of course, yes.
That's the thing. Some people, that would be a problem for them if they've got a lot of factors about their life that makes them a higher risk. You obviously, on a risk assessment, didn't look too high a risk.
No, and to be more accurate, what was on my my DBS was clearly just a result of being in chronic addiction. So, for example, this is the extreme, but, you know, child molesting or sneaking, you know, 5 kilograms of cocaine from Peru, or, you know, murdering somebody 18 years ago. Those kind of things are not on my DVS, clearly. And if they were, I wouldn't have gotten the jobs that I'd got in for good reason.
Yeah,
But it was
mental health problems.
Yeah.
It's about the risk assessment.
A risk
Just
assessment,
to be fair
yes,
to the
yeah.
people that have got high risk.
Yeah. So so that was, yeah, I think it was more of like my view upon it, looking at it and seeing this 17.
But you're also a young
offences
guy that really did show a lot of interest, wanted to learn, wanted to get on, and seemed, you know, people want to give you a chance.
Yeah.
And again, they know you're bringing a lot to the table when you've had that sort of experience. You know, in our sort of job, having a criminal record is a plus.
Yeah, it seems that we've got a bit of first-hand experience when somebody walks in the door.
Especially if you've overcome it and you've got that lived experience, which is becoming more of a thing, I think.
Yeah.
The people are putting a lot more value on lived experience, not just qualification.
Well, that's interesting, because I do remember the amount of evening conversations where the therapy and the work and the washing up and all of the things to keep us busy and develop in recovery and ECR, with all sat around, the amount of conversations that were had, like, I can't believe it when I look around, all of these people were in addiction, you know, not all of them, I don't think it was a rule that you had to be, but a lot of people were in recovery themselves. This was revolutionary, because like I said 20 minutes ago, the only people that I knew that got free from drugs was because they were 6 feet under the ground or in prison. And if they was in prison, they was probably still using anyway. Yeah. It just didn't happen.
See, that's
so
one of the important things
centre,
about the 12-step fellowships like Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous. So if you go in them rooms, you're going to find 20, 40 people that have overcome addiction, which a lot of people, again, don't even know that's possible, which is why we say recovery is possible.
Yeah,
Complete
especially in
recovery.
smaller towns where I come from.
Yeah, I
In
think it's-
cities, now I can compare the two.
Yeah.
In cities, it's a bit more in addicts' minds that if they want to, NA's down the road, but a lot of them choose not to do it, and some of them choose to do it. But in a small town where I come from, no, I'd never even heard of these things.
No, I never did till I come into recovery. Never known anyone giving up drinking. In actual fact, it was a weird thing. If you
Weird
didn't
thing
drink,
to do
you're
it.
a bit strange. Or you know, where I grew up, if you said to someone I didn't drink, they said, "What, you're on antibiotics?" They thought you had VD. It was kind of like the only reason to not drink.
Antibiotics. So yeah, I'm sorry to answer your question. I didn't really find it that difficult. At that stage.
No. Okay. Well, yeah, that is really interesting to know, and I hope that gives a lot of people hope, though, as well. You mentioned that you worked with a lot of young people as well after that. So you kind of did your stint at the homeless shelter, and then you helped the young man with his issues, and then went on to do some work with County Lines, but also working in one of the colleges in town, right?
Yes.
And that sounds quite interesting, because something that you mentioned to me earlier, which I think would be great to unpack, is this idea of mental health diagnosis and how a lot of these diagnoses result in prescribed medicines, which is a whole nother issue of addiction in itself. So with your first-hand experience of that, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the problems that you perceive there with these prescriptions, and particularly with the diagnosis and the idea that these are kind of band-aids. They're not really discussing and dealing with the root causes of the issues, but instead they're just kind of alleviating some of the effects and again, potentially causing greater harm down the line.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's important to say this, and I said before we started the podcast that I've never met anyone with bad intentions as of yet in my jobs that I've had over the years. I've never gone into a job and sat down with somebody in an office and they're like, "Right, I really want to screw up this patient's life." It's not like that. It's like, how can we help these people?
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to that word empowering. That I won't mention where I work just because I might have continued relationships with them, and as I said on the way here, that I don't really need to, because the approach that I was participating in and saw is the general approach of the UK as a whole in treating mental health or substance misuse. It's a generalised approach, unless you go to the private sector in a place like Leicester's and 12-step orientated, then it's quite a different approach. But I soon became aware, that working in homeless hostels was a key thing. As I said, the majority of my working life, I worked in higher education. I had 2 jobs, and I also worked, because I worked in education, I only worked 9 months of the year. So I had 3 months of the year where I wasn't working. So I had a second job just to bring in an extra income, as my wife did. We both worked in the 2 same jobs. We had 4 jobs between us. And it was a fantastic lifestyle. But I soon became aware that there was a continued approach to, even say for instance, the amount of times I've got anxiety because I've got an interview, I'm not sure I can do this, and then the general approach was, well, maybe you should go back to your doctor and see if you can get your medication increased, or maybe you need it changing. Let's have a look at this anxiety, And then I've got depression, and I'm not even exaggerating. This I try to keep this in reality, not minimise or maximise. I try to keep it in reality. Now, I'm going to make up a hypothetical person, but hopefully captures the reality of my experience. There would be an overweight young person, 18 years old, that stayed awake all night on an Xbox, smoked weed, drank Red Bull, was sleeping around, eating 1 pot noodle a day. When they got paid, they would go out and eat McDonald's.
How hypothetical is that?
This is reality. This is reality.
Well,
and
there's a lot
then
of
they're
geeks,
saying I'm
It's not funny.
depressed,
It's not funny.
and over the years, it's not funny, but it's the reality of
Well,
it.
you're kind of meant to be
Yeah.
depressed, aren't you? That's a healthy
Yeah.
emotion if you're living that lifestyle.
But on this side of the fence, there was no discussion of we need to tell them to stop living this lifestyle. You can't do that because you might hurt their feelings. What we need to do is, look,
Give
he's
him
got
a
his doctorate down the road.
give him a
Studied for
painkiller.
7 years. You need to go in, and he'll give you more medication.
Wow.
How
And
old
there
were
was
these-
no discussion.
How old were the kids? That was genuine kids.
In this context, and I won't name the organisation.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think that's a general.
It's a general approach.
Around the country,
Yeah.
it's not.
16 to 24 in this where I was working in these hostels.
So what was the they were hoping? What would be the outcome they were hoping for? By I guess they were. I don't even know what to say really. They were supporting his lifestyle.
Yes.
Their lifestyle.
Supporting the lifestyle, and you know what? I just
Because it was
looked
their
up.
choice.
It was their choice, and it was kind of like I was looking last night. I spent 20 minutes just having a few look at things ready for this, and the harm reduction
Yeah.
initiative strategy, and you could almost say that the same approach is a cop-out approach. It's just one just to keep everything relatively quiet and relatively good, you know, but without trying to progress. And you could say it was that. It was just harm
So
reduction.
what would have been the hope then? What would have been the best outcome that they would be expecting that person would, once they got everything they want,
Yeah.
that they would just start all of a sudden
I'm just going to get
making more of an
straight
effort?
to the point. And you know what? There was no hope other than this. Make sure they're not calling the paramedics once a week because they're overdosing, because that's not looking good on paper. Try and make sure that they have a successful move on, because that was important.
These were conversations, or were these just? There was just
No, but that was the general feel.
That's what.
And I didn't pick up on this after 3 months of working there. It was after years of working there that the cracks start to appear. And maybe that's just because of my awareness, and I was empowered when I was on the other side of the fence to completely transform my life and my response to life. So all I saw was, in a legal and moderated and trying to be safe way, we was just making things worse. If that made sense.
Yeah.
An illegal, safe,
Well,
moderated way.
enabling does. It just allows the
Enabling.
person to continue in their ways, but with the tools or methods that you're given, that you're restricted to using, and if that was the outcome of the people that was not self-motivated, it's almost like an institutionalisation. I think that people don't have to necessarily be in an institution; they can be on benefits, going to these organisations, and it kind of doesn't prepare them for the real world. It prepares them for that world, so they tend to stay in that world.
I think this was probably one of the reasons where I started to think about things a bit differently from, say, my colleagues. Not all, and I'm quite lucky really, because my wife saw it as I did as well, and other people, but they were certainly in the minority. That it got to a point where I became aware of it, and then it got to a point where I became a bit uncomfortable continuing it, because I was aware of it, and I was just, am I going to continue doing this even though I think it's wrong? I'm still getting paid, and it's a good job, because they were good jobs. It got to a point where I wanted to do this. If that person that I hypothetically just made up came to the office and had a tear running down their eyes and said, "Can you make me a doctor's appointment, please? I need to go get some more medication." I was at the point where I wanted to say this: crap, nonsense. I think you need to book up your ideas, come down in the morning, eat healthily, stop playing your Xbox, stop smoking weed, stop sleeping around, stop doing all of these things. I think you're talking out your arse. I am then professionally bound not to say that, because I might hurt their feelings. But I think that's where the point of progression is, and that's where professionally I'm stopped.
You could get,
I think that's
you could
where
get
it is.
14 years in prison for that.
That's where.
And how long were your sessions with these people?
I mean, it varied. I haven't really got an answer to that because in what we're talking about now in the homeless hostels, it would just be shift work, and we would have I'd have a caseload. You would have appointed times with them.
But with the younger people, sorry.
There was neither rhythm nor rhyme to it because their needs varied.
Okay.
So sometimes I could be sat for 3 hours with one person just going over the same old stuff. And some people I never saw. All they wanted was a roof over their head and a fry up on a Sunday morning. You never saw them. They just avoided me. So there was neither rhythm nor rhyme to that. When I worked in children's homes, that was very, very structured.
Because I guess there must have been outcomes needed to be recorded, that you'd have to record certain things to show that they're doing well. They must have had to have done something to get.
Yeah, there was outcomes. And again, it varied. Some people come in and they come from a relatively good family, and I say relatively. And some people came in and they were of the nature of mum and dad were drug addicts. I've been abused. I've lived on the streets. I have zero education, and they're very, very difficult people to work with. So the outcomes and their goals and their aims as a key worker and as a client, as a stakeholder, would vary depending on the person. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the times, for the reason that I've just said, is because you can't tell them the truth because it might hurt their feelings. The outcomes were never achieved.
So how did you get the results to get the funding?
Manipulating paperwork.
Really?
To make sure funding come in.
Do you think everyone was...
I saw that even, again, I'm not going to mention the establishment, but I've even seen it in education.
Well, you have to... I think I always found when I worked in certain projects, see, my standard was taxpayers, because I knew that was possible, like yourself. So I knew that's possible, because I believe recovery is possible to get people back paying tax and getting on with what we consider a normal life. But some of the projects that I work in that didn't understand how to empower people, they become more enabling, so they would reduce the standards to, giving them a home, getting them sort of balanced. Again, it's only in like a period of time. I see it on LinkedIn this morning that they got a guy and they're really bigging him up because he's stopped drinking and he's at a family event and how wonderful it is because he's been sober for a few months. And I'm like, that's not really a sign of success, a few months. It's good, obviously. You don't want to undermine anyone. But recovery is, you kind of got to get into the years to start seeing this person's actually stable and they're not going to revert back. But in a few months, I mean, the first year, that's the biggest relapse period. So sort of, when you get people coming into rehab, they're obviously very sick because they're poisoning themselves. So when you stop them poisoning themselves and then feed them, they start getting good night's sleep and they start relaxing. They start looking healthy very quickly. And then
I noticed that.
Yeah, and the families are like, oh, it's wonderful, but it's really a false flag.
You're just seeing the physical get better. That's the quickest and easiest thing.
Anyway, look, we can get everyone off drugs in this country in 2 weeks, 100%. But you ain't going to keep them off. So physical recovery and mental and emotional recovery, just not the same thing. And the evidence is more in, I like Kelly, like her mum, I think I use her as an example, that she did a podcast for us a few years ago and she said, I knew Kelly was getting better, not because she looked well, because I've been through that before. I knew something had changed about Kelly when we went in a coffee shop. And we both ordered a cup of coffee, we both ordered a cake, and Kelly paid. She said, right then, I knew something had changed.
Very small and subtle but profound.
But because, again, the mum knew that usually she was constantly taking and a drain. When your mind becomes empowered, you start contributing back in. That's the whole evidence that you'll stop being so selfish. Not that you're not drinking. Again, I think it's a big problem, even in the 12-step fellowships. They think they're doing well because they're not drinking or taking drugs anymore, yet they're carrying on the damage in their families because they're incredibly selfish, self-centered, self-seeking people. So it's a different kind of evidence. Of course, it's good they stop using,
Yeah.
but from what I believe, that's not really great evidence that they're being very successful in their life, because they're not functioning. And it's like them kids, you know, they might, even if they're on the street, they get them off the street and put them in a home. So they're like, oh, well, that looks good. We can tick a box.
Well, and it's not only a tick in a box. That's ready for the end of March when they have the awards at wherever in Norwich. I can't remember the name of the place on Bank Plain. There's a place there.
Yeah.
We used to have the awards there, and they could get up on stage and do their photo shoots for the EDP and hold up their certificates. And this is their success story, and they do huge success story. But
So I got 4 of them awards,
the rate of progression.
and I want to throw them in the bin. We just moved, and I just found I got 4 awards from the local authorities, and I'm telling my wife I want to throw these in the bin because I don't think they mean anything to me.
So there's sort of short-term wins, aren't they, that don't really tackle the bigger problem.
I think the reason that they give them is wrong. It's not that I didn't deserve them. I think I did deserve the awards, my staff and my organisation. I think we definitely deserved them, but I think the reason we were given them was wrong.
It was long, yeah.
And I don't like that, because again, it's society's got this bit of a dark side to. Again, if somebody said to me, well, what would you do to change everything? I'd say that. Well, first of all, tell all the organisations, you're going to get your funding for the next 5 years. All we want is accurate.
What really surprised me, and this was this really showed me how, when organisations need funding, why this happens. That when I went to work in education, I was leaving. At the core, I was leaving away treating anxiety, depression, substance misuse and homelessness, just to name a few. I was going into a completely different context, people wanting education. So the substance misuse, anxiety and depression were just something that was dealt with on the side, but the main reason of my job purpose and the place of higher education was for education. So it was a different nature. And I didn't notice this within a year or even 2 years, but after 3-4 years, you started to notice things with patterns, don't you? And as time goes on, you become a bit more aware of how things work. That in June, we would get next year's students coming in, and depending on where I was working at the time, we would meet our students in June, and whether they was coming from another college because they was misbehaving, or whether they was coming from a school because they was going to be 16 when they was entering college, would vary. But we would get pass-on papers, we would get pass-on grades, we would get a portfolio of this person and where they were at academically. And they would say, right, they've got a C in this, a D in this, they've got an F in that, major work needed, blah, blah, blah. You get the picture. So, okay, right, so this is June, we're going to have the summer holidays, they're going to start in September, 4th, 5th, 6th of September. And now we've got a starting point that meets where they are in a way that we can progress in an achievable manner. But what we would notice is that they would come in June, July for the assessment, we'd have the summer holidays, we'll come back in September, all raring to go, we just had 6 weeks off for the summer holidays. And by the end of October, November, we'd be like, man, half of these people are struggling, they're not at these grades. And then we would report that to management and to leaders, and they'll be like, right, okay, yeah, just kind of do your best and just try and, things can't be changed at that point. You've got really little scope to change things.
Because really the solution would be to go back and get
to
a
go
better
back,
foundation.
To go back, yeah, and start them at a lower foundation. But that changes paperwork, which brings in funding.
Yeah.
And then what we would see as we got back round to April, May, June, and then we start and assessments, or some of them were doing, I even worked in business studies and cooking and stuff like that, where people were doing degrees, even maths and engineering. Not tutoring, I was a learning support practitioner, was they were falling behind. So what we would do is no one, and again, it falls into this, I never met anyone with bad intentions, I never met anyone that all went out to tell a lie. But you would amplify,
do the right thing,
yeah,
to get the best outcome.
The best outcome, you could see how things were. They would lower the standard So they're struggling would meet the standards, so you could tick the box and make sure that the funding come in. And you see the cycle going
But
through.
they're doing that like it's a good thing to try and help the people, but it doesn't. 'Cause
It doesn't
really
help.
still
It
leaves
keeps,
them quite unprepared.
It's going to make them struggle for where they go to next year.
And
Because they thinking they're up here, but they're not. They're down here. So they set the work up here, and then they struggle, and then the next person follows the cycle. And I think that's the problem when you rely on funding and you're under pressure to meet certain statistics.
Yeah, that would be my
Targets.
conclusion. That's what I say. If I was in charge, it would be like, you get your funding for 5 years, just give us accurate statistics so we can...
And then you've got something to work on.
It's like there's an incentive for manipulation, but there's no incentive for the honest results.
No, because it's not good. I think that's the thing. A lot of it is like, it's just not the truth. We always say this: do you want the truth or something beautiful? So the truth, it kind of does hurt.
Yeah.
You know, especially with a lot of people. It's like I'm sort of a little bit. I say like I'm famous. Not a lot of people know it, but for being straight talking, that people say things like, "Oh, I feel really guilty," or it's like, "You are, mate. You are guilty." "Oh, I feel like I'm a really bad mother." "Yeah, you are. You're on heroin. You're not really turning up. You're not a good mother." Because if you keep telling them they are good, or what they're doing doesn't... See, a lot of them emotions I've learned, feeling guilty, it's a very healthy emotion. Being depressed, a lot of people say, "I've got depression." I'm like, I doubt it. I've no doubt you're depressed, but I'd be depressed if I was living like you. That's a very healthy emotion. All them antidepressants are doing is giving you painkillers so you can carry on causing yourself harm. It's not an accurate assessment of what's actually... They're not teaching you to read the reality right. And again, one thing I've learned sort of physically, spiritually, emotionally, on every level of life, I can't think of anything that this rule doesn't apply. You cannot change what you don't accept. And see, one of the greatest words we use in recovery is acceptance. Now, a lot of people, because they're powerless, the powerless people, when you say you have to accept, they think you've got to put up with it, because that's a powerless... A lot of words are like that. You have a powerless interpretation, then you have a powerful interpretation. The powerful interpretation is acceptance means you accept the situation as it is by the facts, and then you relate correctly to it. And a lot of the time, if you need to change, then you need to change. It's in like the serenity prayer. It's, "God grant me the serenity, the peace of mind, to accept the things I cannot change." Now that can be difficult. It's things that we cannot change. I've struggled with that because I'm got more of a personality that likes to change things. So it's, "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, but then I need courage to change the things I can." And so doing good infantry really helps me to understand, look, what can I change, what can't I change? And if you're not telling people, look, mate, you need to take... It's your ability to respond is the problem. And if you want to keep blaming everybody else, or keep expecting everyone to feed you because you're not able to feed yourself, and they're happy to do that, well, you're never going to change, because you need to accept you're a child, you're a man boy, or
Man boy.
well, there's a lot of them. They're grown men, but they're really like 11 years old, the way they behave, their education, their ability. And it's like, if you're not willing to accept that, then you're not going to go and do anything to change. So they sit in these organisations where there usually is a lot of support and help for them, but they don't think they need it, or they don't understand enough. Mate, you need to turn up and go through all the challenges that you're going to have to go through so you can develop. And we find in good recovery, it kind of sets that intention for people like yourself. It's like, look, there's going to be challenges, but you've got to get on the path, and you will grow, you will develop, and you will mature. And as a result of that, your responses are improved, and you'll make better choices, and you'll get better outcomes for yourself. Not that we don't all depend on each other and society to a degree, but I think society is always trying to set up these codependent relationships where I have to depend on them. I'm a staunch conservative. I like small government. I don't want to depend on the government. They're not very dependable, are they?
No,
I kind of like interdependent, where I'm equipped in my own right, and I like that, being around other people, that we can then come together and work together, rather than having all these grown people that are like children, because they're still dependents.
That's interesting, because looking back to, and again, if you can find anybody that doesn't fall into this, then I'll be amazed. But anybody that's in chronic addiction is by the nature of it dependable. I was dependable 100% on people around me. My mum and dad, they enabled me for many years, and I was completely dependable. I had zero independence, and that in itself is like a sickness. And looking back and now comparing to being quite an independent person, that itself is like a sickness, that dependence. Because when you're in the nature, when you're in the company of another person, there's always an agenda subconsciously. And I find that you would manipulate the way that you talk and go into that emotional pulling kind of talking, because there's an agenda, there's something that I want. That in itself is like a sickness.
Yeah,
So it falls into that empowering.
I'd say in America they celebrate Independence Day. Do you know who that independence from? Us.
Yes.
From England. England's just heavily dependent, it seems. And you go to America, they've probably gone a little bit too far with the independence, because there's not so much help when you are struggling, but they haven't got such a heavy benefit system that we have, which again, it does a lot of good, but it does a lot of harm. It's just identifying the difference in the people. Again, I like that serenity prayer. It's being able to identify what needs to change and what I need to accept. But I think addiction, what I've learned for all my years in addiction treatment, it's all about dependency. Not just chemical dependency, it's about people and relationship dependency, and how unhealthy they can get. And if you've got unhealthy dependencies on whatever, it's going to cause you harm.
I think we was talking on the way here, and I think at one point I said that when I was in the mainstream working in those jobs that I've had over the years, that you could talk about the nature of why somebody is treating themselves in this self-sabotage, abusive way of taking these drugs, staying awake all night, or doing whatever it is, this destructive, addictive lifestyle, that if I was speaking to managers or people in the NHS, they would get to a point where I would have to say, I can't talk any further about what we're talking about, the nature of this problem, without throwing in a word like spirituality. And at that point, there's a cut-off. You can't engage with most of these people any further from that point, because they don't want to go into that territory. But now as we've been talking, I do believe that for me it was a spiritual thing. If I was going to revert back to a medicine-based approach or a therapeutic-based approach, even though I think therapy certainly has its place, that there's that point where I think a spiritual program and the empowering of that and a certain level of dependency is broken because of this new spiritual path.
Yeah, because it talks about developing and finding the power within yourself, which again is what I think we are
Which
talking
what you want,
about.
isn't it?
Yeah,
when people
no, I think
leave,
once people find,
you don't need.
No, well,
It's in within
not
yourself.
unhealthy. We all need each other, and there is healthy dependencies, because you get your interdependency, but we all need to depend on each other at different times in our life. But when people are empowered, they find that power in themselves. But I think you have to reach a certain level of enlightenment or consciousness before that power actually becomes something that you discover. And I think if you're not being shown that, I think in our environment, that's one of the things we say, look, we've got this spiritual element, this power needs to be activated in you, but there's also a very material and physical development also needs to occur to allow them to start working together. And but I think that's very much the power that higher power that we're talking about. It doesn't have to be God, but we realise that in the human brain, when you sort of scan the brain, there's a lot of energy running through it, and them people you're talking about, that are sort of stuck in that lower mind, if you scan their brains, there's not much activity, which is why there's not much activity in their life. They're living in this state of not enough activity, so they're, like not having to go at homeless people or people that are dependent, but they're giving less. They're the people that are expecting to take the most because they've not got a lot of activity. So you want to increase the activity in their brain, and they haven't got it. So really, it does fall on the rest of us that do have that to try and get around them or find ways of getting around them to increase their desire to have more activity in their life. Hopefully, so they can, instead of being a deficit, they can start feeding themselves and contributing a lot more back than what they're taking. It's kind of like the goal. It's what makes you successful, isn't it?
And when I said that we have to talk about beyond the discussion that we've just had about the medicinal approach, the therapeutic approach, those things, and I have to talk about my experience about a spiritual path, and which initiated from the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I think it was, if I was to boil it down, it'd be this: that the spiritual path gave me enough empowerment within myself that I can go off and live my life without calling that action, without feeling the need to take 2 years off sick because I'm anxious, but to be a productive, maintaining, contributing member of society that can look after myself. I'm not going to abuse myself, those kind of things, and just get on in life with a certain degree of enjoyment, productivity and usefulness. And if you can do that, and then if you want to go above that and go and live on a mountain in India and hibernate for the rest of life, then fantastic, but it's not very productive.
Pay your tax.
But in the context of just trying to live a healthier lifestyle and come from a very addictive, non-useful lifestyle to the opposite.
Well, and then also going on to then help others and having kids and having a wife and sharing your knowledge with the world, and not just taking from people, but getting to that point where you actually have enough knowledge and the ability to give back a bit. You've got that energy to do that. You've opened your mind enough that you can start sharing it with other people in a positive way.
Yeah, because interesting. And if we was going to measure what we would define as recovery or a success, which if you had 1 million people working in the field, you'd probably get 1 million different views of success. But what I said the other day, I don't know whether I was speaking to a friend, I don't know if I was speaking to Dan or yourself, I don't even know if I was speaking to my wife, but anyway, I said that, you know what, and I was speaking about my dad, and this is how it came, that 11 years I used heroin and crack, and I never paid taxes, and I just vacuumed the system. I contributed the least and took the most. And it's now been 11 years where I have worked. I've not been one single day unemployed, legally, officially unemployed, and I've always paid taxes. And I felt quite happy that I had now contributed and rebalanced the scales of karma, for lack of a better way of putting it. I actually felt happy, and I think that's a good mindset, a good identification of good recovery, that I felt happy that I contributed back and rebalanced the scales, and now I can go beyond that in a way that the scales are going to be in favour on my side. But in that sense, it's not in favour on my side, it's in favour of society's side.
Looking at it from a more selfless perspective.
I think that's probably a good approach.
Yeah. Well, I think that's when you start realising that you're a sort of a small part of a bigger whole, that you've got your place. But I feel that, once you start living with a purpose, like you feel like you have a purpose to be here and you've got some direction, then you just automatically have more of a fulfilling life experience. And, whatever your version of success is, it's achievable. And I think that then that obviously encourages people to go through the difficult periods, which we do. I find it's sad that they have a lot of difficulty but no real joy. and then I think life can then look very bleak, and I would propose that's probably where the suicides start occurring, and they just think, it's just too hard. I mean, I was like that, sort of 30 years old. I thought, I can't live like this. It's too hard. And I was 5 years in recovery. But something in my mind changed. I found a higher power, something that was bigger than me, that gave my life more purpose and meaning. And I think that's important to find that power inside yourself. But if you haven't got that, I do think you need other people to show you the way, which is what good recovery, them sort of, good scout leaders, good, boys football club, good boxing, all of them sort of unsung heroes that know that there's something more for them kids to aspire. I mean, I found that interesting with churches, because when you look at the big old churches, the big old buildings and the cathedrals with the big old towers, and you go in them, they are inspiring, but there was people often would say things like, well, why did they build all them buildings when around them everyone was starving? Why didn't they give the money to the people? And I think it was for that reason that we're talking about. It's because even like the church, the pointy bit's called aspire, isn't it?
Something to aspire to.
It was to aspire people around to think that there's something far more than what they've got to lift them up, to raise them up. And I kind of like that even knowing, like your brain talks we do, where your brain opens, it kind of raises you up to a higher power in your own mind that gives you more functionality, which gives you more ability to do more things in your life and
to strive, to be inspired.
Yeah, it's like being set free.
Yeah,
like you were set free. There's nothing really wrong with you underneath that addiction. Once that addiction was taken off here and your brain kicked in, you went off into the world and built yourself a life, which we see multiple times. Well, once the brain gets set free, nature kicks in again, evolution kicks in, and then you start naturally wanting to develop and grow and follow your dreams, your ambitions, but you have the capacity to do that. And I think that's the important thing. Addiction and certain medications
take away the capacity.
Yes, so you end up not giving very much in a very limited state, and you're stuck there. And I feel society can do that to people, and I think it's pretty bad.
Limited state. I'll tell you, this is like, again, I said at the start of the podcast, I don't want to labour my using too much, because I think you have to always balance talking about the war stories, as they say in the meetings, as opposed to, right, this is what I've gained, this is my life now, this is the good that I feel, etc., etc. But I always remember this one little story, and I think it really captures how sad and zero capacity I had to think anywhere beyond this lifestyle. There was this fella, right, and he had a car accident with his brother, and he got £100,000, and he lived in a council house. He was at the age I was about 25, 26, 27. I was going around there for about 3 years, and he was selling heroin, and I was scoring heroin from him at the time. And he got this £100,000, and I remember this house, and because it captures just how sad life was. He had a dark red carpet and orange wallpaper. He had a big TV with Sky, and there was a huge hexagon wooden table, and he had a big armchair that he always used to sit in. And he had Sky TV, and he'd always, every single day, because he got all of this money for a good period of time, because he sold as well, so it balanced the money. There was always a big pile of heroin there, and he never went without. And I used to go around there, and I used to make him cups of tea, and I'd be able to get heroin on tick. And do you know what my aspiration was? I wanted to be sat in that chair. That was as far as my aspiration got. I was jealous of his lifestyle. Mad. It's insane.
Now you've achieved it. You have to send a picture of your front room.
For me, we even got the hexagon table. Just need to get the Sky TV. I'm going to have a word with my boss for a pay rise. And here's the thing as well. Talking about young people, I was thinking about this last night, and county lines, is we live in the Western developed world, and life is easy if we want it to be in terms of your immediate needs: food, shelter, medicine. You know, we're not living in a third world country. And I think that's caused a degree of laziness in people and took away people's strive to be able to produce a life that's going to be, fruitful and satisfying and meet their immediate needs and beyond those immediate needs in the future. And I saw in county lines, it's like this identity thing with anywhere as young as 11 years old going up to 16, 17-year-old, and then we don't see them past that age because they're no longer a child and they won't fit into our service. That within 2 days you could go and fit into a tribe. Yeah, you could be initiated because you've carried £10,000 worth of heroin from Bristol to Birmingham. And that's your initiation done. And then you could go get your office clothes, which consisted of an Armani tracksuit. And then you could go get your office bag and get your Hugo Boss bag where you could put your phone and start to create your own little business network. And within the space of a week, you've created everything that takes 5 years to create if you was to go to education, get a job and work your way up in a field. And it was a huge insight into county lines. That it wasn't just about the money, it was the whole profile lifestyle that came with that.
Yeah, if people are sort of more satisfied, they're a lot harder to groom.
Yes, yeah.
When
They've
people
got a
are
deeper value on things.
Yeah, when people are unsatisfied or unloved or feel less than, I found that myself, is that the gangsters really loved them because they made me feel important, which I obviously didn't. And they made me feel like I fitted in or somebody special, which again I didn't get that from my school. So you notice that they were very
susceptible to
you were
to
very
abuse.
drawn
Yeah.
to them and to do what they wanted. Because it just made you feel good, and obviously something that you're very much lacking. So I guess again the environment again is a key thing, isn't it? And again, I think this maybe it's time for another podcast. We can have another talk about this. I think society is making things super difficult for a lot of people. Like even saying in the education that they lowered it down, but again, I think that's a very real problem, isn't it? That something's breaking down at the beginning, at the family, level, that we need to, that them children, that when they get to them sort of places in university, they should be able to deal with what's coming. Again, I can only use my own experience that I didn't learn the fundamentals at school, so I went through the whole of my school career. I left at 15 with no exams because I didn't understand the fundamentals, and that's because, a lot of troubles at home and nobody was really focused on my education. So it's like just piling it on. I'm getting angrier and angrier, and you've missed the mainstream. Where you fit in is with all the little villains in the. You drop out of the mainstream society where you feel like you fit in. 'Cause I didn't fit in the mainstream, and then I wasn't very good at being good, but I was good at being bad, it turns out, because that was the endorsement I was getting from the older gangsters that were giving me the nourishment that I wasn't getting from the mainstream. And I remember for a period of time there, I had big chunks of change in my pocket. We used to say I had a roll big enough to choke a donkey. And all of the guys that
I never had that.
all of the guys that had really worked hard at school or were bumping up in the same clubs that had regular jobs, they had very little money. I'd pull out a big wad of cash that I'd got from crime. Felt like I'd made it, but then I deteriorated.
And they
progressed.
Short-term pain, long-term gain, or short-term...
Yeah. But you didn't know. That's where I felt you fitted in. And I hated it. I realised that by the time I was 23, that I hate this. It's not right either. But where do you go when you don't know?
And when you don't know, it's something I thought about, and it's only because my children are 3 and 7. The environment and the right upbringing, I think, is, and maybe that's just it's the father in me that focuses a lot on that nowadays. But creating the right nourishing and encouraging and the right kind of environment so they can go off and they know how to deal with the problems that life is inevitably going to present to us later on in life.
So I think all that's important, but I think it's the other end of the scale. It's how they respond to it. That's the key, I think, is seeing how do my children respond to situations, because that's going to be the determination of the choices that they're going to make.
Yeah.
You know, have they got the ability to respond in a healthy manner? Because I'm still learning that in lots of ways in my life. And again, I rely on other people to help me respond in certain areas of life that I don't trust my own responses. They're still too aggressive. That I need to help other people. So even the kids that have been brought up in a wonderful families, that's not a guarantee that they're going to grow up more wonderful. It's a lot higher. Like when I think we did that with the ACEs, we could see that growing up in very disturbing childhoods is going to give you a massive disadvantage in doing well. But you know, we meet kids brought up in really good families that didn't. I think again they had this addiction thing going on, this response problem, and you know that's why I like to liken it to like a peanut allergy. That if you're born with a peanut allergy, you're never going to know till you have a peanut. So if you never have a peanut, I think that's the thing in America where it's caused these opiate crisis, is that the doctors are giving it willy-nilly, pretty much giving opiates to people that on prescription that never normally would be introduced to opiates, and it's kicked off their addiction. And so, you know, they've then they end up buying it off the streets. But so I kind of like that idea that it's like an allergy, but you'd never know until you do it. But
until you activate it.
Until it gets activated.
Yeah, and it's incredibly complex thing, addiction, because I have encountered people that come from the most loveliest house, the most loveliest mum and dad. They've got jobs, there's money in the banks, they've got a £250,000 house that they're going to inherit in 8 years, and all of these things, and they ended up exactly where I ended up.
Yeah, well, Kelly, I think she says she didn't feel comfortable in her nice household. Now, look, I'm sure there was issues in there. She felt comfortable on the council estate.
Yeah.
And so that lower companionship seemed to work better for her. So again, it's something going on in the brain, isn't it?
I think there you go. It's all about environment, isn't it? Ultimately, the responses to these situations, and then the environment that you're in that can nurture those responses.
I think so, mate. I think once society gets their head around that, I think we're going to have a lot better treatments, because we'll be able to monitor people a lot better.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's our time. So thank you very much for joining us today, Anthony. If you're interested, I'd love to get you back on again in the future, because it sounds like you've got a lot of experience and you're doing a good job putting it across. So I really appreciate that.
Cool.
So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you, Lester. Thank you, everybody. Again, I'll put some links in the show notes for a few articles that we've written, and some links to Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And once again, we do offer free assessments as well. So if you want to give us a call and talk about anything addiction related, then we're happy to go through that with you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
God bless.